If you think horror needs an alleyway, this case will change your mind. Picture Massachusetts Avenue Heights in Washington, D.C., a pocket of money and marble, where embassies sit behind ironwork and the night is more hush than darkness. On Woodland Drive Northwest, the houses don't shout, they glide. This is where chauffeurs idle, gardeners speak softly, and a 10-year-old boy can practice piano in a room bigger than most apartments. Inside one of those homes lived the Savopoulos family. Savas, 46, construction executive, polished and precise, who helped put steel into some of the city's most recognizable buildings. Amy, 47, gracious, organized, the kind of mother who could run a home like a well-timed production and still remember everyone's birthdays. Philip, 10, small, bright, racing cars on weekends, practicing martial arts, still at the age where tomorrow is a promise, not a negotiation. And the person who made day-to-day life possible. Vera Figueroa, 57, their housekeeper, steady as a heartbeat, trusted enough to have a key and a place at the table. On Wednesday, May 13, 2015, the ordinary choreography shifted by a degree no one noticed at first. Calls were missed. A second housekeeper was told not to come. The family's schedule, normally crisp, went blurry at the edges. Those who knew the Savopouloses chalked it up to a busy week. D.C. is a city built on busy. But inside the house, the day had already turned. Sometime that afternoon, according to what investigators reconstructed later, a home invasion hardened into a hostage situation. The people inside were tied with tape. The voices they used became whispers, and a plan took shape, vicious and patient. Hold the family overnight, demand money in the morning, and erase the scene with fire. Evening fell, and the house put on its usual face. Dimmed lights, a silhouette in a second-floor window. Nobody walking a dog would have guessed that dinner that night included pizza, ordered in under pressure, the boxes coming to the door like any other midweek indulgence. One detail from those boxes would later burn through the case like a fuse. DNA left on a crust. The kind of trace you don't notice when you're hungry or scared, but that is a problem for tomorrow. For now, the house stays quiet, the way expensive houses are good at staying quiet. By morning, Thursday, May 14th, the plan's next step clicked into place. A package needed to move, $40,000 in cash. The instruction went to a trusted assistant, a young man who did what assistants do. He followed directions without asking the kind of questions you only know to ask once you can't sleep. He picked up the money at a business tied to the family. He drove it across the city. He left it where he was told to leave it, and he left. The delivery took minutes. Understanding what he just participated in would take months. Back inside the house, fear did what fear does. It shrank the rooms. It slowed time. It made parents bargain with the air. The boy, Philip, was at the center of that bargaining, the pressure point, the leverage. That detail will haunt you if you let it, and you should let it. Because if you don't feel the cruelty here, the rest becomes a puzzle instead of a crime. Late afternoon, an alarm flickered. A 911 hang-up, the kind of call dispatchers handle 100 times, with nothing at the end of it. Patrol units rolled anyway. Protocol is stubborn by design. When firefighters arrived, they saw smoke shouldering out of a window and a red sports car missing from the driveway. They forced the door, moved fast, and met a heat that said arson more clearly than any accelerant label ever could. The rooms told the rest without words. In one, a woman. In another, a man. Nearby, a child. Elsewhere, the housekeeper who had given years of her life to this family. All four dead. All showing brutal, blunt force injuries. The child also stabbed, tape on wrists, tape on ankles, fire as a final insult. Outside, neighbors gathered the way neighborhoods do, on lawns and sidewalks, phones in their hands because hands need something to do. The police line went up, and with it a kind of civic disbelief. This zip code buys insulation from chaos. Gated driveways, cameras, the illusion of control. But evil does not respect neighborhood covenants. It finds a door and tries the handle. Detectives started the clock the way detectives always do. Timeline first, then edges. Who was supposed to be here? Who called whom? Which cars left and when? What turned off? What turned on? One detail clanged in the first hours, that red Porsche seen leaving shortly before the fire. It would be found torched not far away, a sports car reduced to a testimonial about panic and gasoline. Another detail arrived from the kitchen trash, the kind of evidence only patient people find. Pizza crust. A small, ordinary hinge on which the whole case would eventually swing. Lab work would match DNA on that crust to a name known in the Savopoulos orbit. A former welder from a company tied to Savas's business life. A man whose first notoriety would come from a headline about pizza and murder. But that's getting ahead of this chapter. For now, the scene is sealed. The coroner writes names onto history. Savas Philip Savopoulos, 46. Amy Claire Savopoulos, 47. Philip Savopoulos, 10. Veralicia Vera Figueroa, 57. Around them, an army of quiet professionals, evidence techs, arson investigators, forensic nurses, begin turning smoke and ash into sentences a jury can read. They collect tape, cord, charred fibers, and the things violence leaves behind when it wants to leave nothing behind. They photograph the pattern of burns, the points of origin, the trail of an accelerant poured with a purpose. They measure blood spatter that isn't only violence, it's geometry you can prove. The wider circle absorbs the blow in ripples. At American Iron Works, employees stop what they're doing because grief can't be carried and welded at the same time. At St. Sophia Greek Orthodox Cathedral, a priest starts drafting things you never want to have to say from a pulpit. At a school, a desk goes empty. In a house far from the crime scene, Idala, Nabs Rarhofers, the other housekeeper, the one told not to come that morning, replays a message and realizes it just saved her life. By nightfall, national media trucks nose along the curb. The phrase DC Mansion Murders settles into lower thirds and will never leave. Commentators speculate and get it wrong in the 100 little ways people get it wrong when they don't have to be right. The investigators don't care about chatter. They care about who and how. Why can wait? Why often has to? If you're looking for a single image that holds the whole tragedy, try this. A grand piano in a room that smells like smoke. Its strings intact, its song undeliverable. It sits there like a witness to a life interrupted, reminding everyone who walks past that luxury is not armor. The city's money belt just learned that the oldest kind of crime can slip into the newest kind of security. The thing about perfect neighborhoods is that they're very good at recording themselves. Doorbells blink, traffic cameras hum, delivery apps quietly stack data in the background. In the DC Mansion Murders, that silent network would do what panic and gasoline tried to erase. Let's start with the most ordinary hinge you can imagine. Pizza. Wednesday night, May 13th. The order goes in not from a couch, but under pressure, inside a house already turned into a hostage scene. 2 pies dropped at the door like any other midweek dinner. The boxes go to the kitchen. The captives eat because hunger doesn't care about terror. Then trash becomes evidence, a pizza crust with DNA that doesn't belong to anyone who lives at Woodland Drive. You don't know its value when you toss it. The lab knows. When the match comes back, it's a name with a history, Darren Dylan Wint. A welder, once on the payroll of American Iron Works, the company run by Savas Savopoulos, not a random drifter, not a phantom, a man with a path that crosses the family's world and a profile that slides too easily into the space between familiar and dangerous. But the crust is only one voice. The city's cameras add a chorus. After the fire on Thursday, May 14th, investigators pull footage like thread. They find the family's Porsche, that sleek signature of success, moving through the city in the hours after the house began to burn. The color on the street is blue, the route precise as a GPS breadcrumb trail. It runs out not far away in Prince George's County, Maryland, where the car is found torched in a church parking lot. Panic looks the same in every zip code. It burns what it can't carry and hopes the flames will eat the fingerprints. Inside the house, the first wave of forensic work tells a hard sequence. Bind, extort, kill, burn. The duct tape is there, the cash demand is there, the blunt force injuries are there, and the accelerant is there, splashed with a purpose that turns a home into a smoke machine. The smallest victim, Philip, shows sharp force wounds and thermal injuries, proof he was still alive when the fire started. That detail is not for shock value, it's for truth. Cruelty is part of this story, and we don't look away. Now the investigation widens to the people orbiting the family. One of them is young and eager, exactly the kind of person who keeps an executive's plate spinning, a personal assistant. The timeline brings him into focus on Thursday morning when he does something he will replay in his head for years. He delivers $40,000 in cash at his boss's direction, leaving it where he's told, and leaves. He doesn't kick down doors or call the police, because the day doesn't look like a ransom drop when you're in it. It looks like an errand with authority behind it. Only later does it rearrange itself into the worst kind of compliance. As the case tightens, the name from the pizza crust becomes the center of gravity. Wint isn't just a match in a database. He's someone with a track record and a reason to know this house could be leveraged. Detectives push warrants through the system. A manhunt begins. Not cinematic car chases, but the new, technical kind. Phones pinged, cars watched, addresses sat on by teams wearing out their coffee. A week after the murders, on May 21st, the quiet pursuit turns loud. Night. Northeast DCA vehicle stops. Task force officers swarm. Darren Wint is inside with multiple other people. He doesn't go easy, and it doesn't matter. Cuffs, lights. The name from the crust now has a face under a street lamp and a booking number waiting downtown. When they inventory the car, the list looks like a disaster kit for a bad plan. Cash, knives, multiple cell phones, the tools of someone moving fast and trying to stay ahead of a story that's already caught him. Back at the lab, they do the careful, boring work that wins trials. Swabs, photos, chain of custody forms with more signatures than a mortgage. From the outside, the case looks simple now. DNA, motive, arrest. Inside, it's still complex. Detectives are sure more than one person moved through that house. They can feel it in the logistics, the length of the captivity, the control required, the cash drop, the car switch, the timed fire. But proving cooperation beyond a reasonable doubt is a different mountain. It requires the kind of evidence you can show a jury without asking them to make leaps. And for that, the state has one man whose trace is on the pizza, whose former employer is the victim's company, whose movements and messages and companions don't fit the story of a bystander swept up in somebody else's horror. The assistant, the one with the $40,000, goes from a name on a schedule to a key witness. He sits in rooms with detectives, and later in a courtroom with jurors, and he tells the part he knows. The texts, the calls, the pickup, the drop, the instructions that came with a weight he didn't recognize until too late. Defense lawyers will pick at him about what he saw, what he didn't see, what he should have understood, but his role never changes. He is the delivery mechanism for a ransom, not the architect of a crime. Meanwhile, The narrative firms up around Wint's link to American Iron Works. He used to work for a company run by Savas. He knows the culture, maybe even the rhythms of when cash is available and who moves it. Prosecutors argue the invasion wasn't random. It was targeted, planned enough to hold a family 19 hours, extract money, and try to wipe the scene with fire. Planned enough to order pizza to keep going. Planned enough to leave almost nothing, except a crust. Some cases hinge on confessions. This one doesn't. It hinges on sweat equity facts, a pizza box timestamp, surveillance frames of a blue Porsche threading the city, the arson pattern that tells you where the fire started and where it was fed, the tape that captured wrists and ankles, the pings that locate phones against the map of that day, the cash that shows up where it shouldn't, the DNA that doesn't lie. By summer, the charge sheet reads like a list built to make sure nothing slips. First-degree murder while armed, kidnapping, burglary, extortion, arson, theft. The phrase "did not act alone" follows the case like a shadow, but it never turns into a second indictment. The state tells jurors what it can prove, and what it can prove is that one man crossed the line from opportunity to unthinkable violence, and that he did so with a patience that chills. A night, a morning, an afternoon, and then a match. If there's a single moment when the investigation stops being a mystery and becomes a case, it's this. A lab tech standing at a workstation, a plastic swab drying, a report printing that ties Woodland Drive to a name the detectives already know how to find. Everything after that is logistics. Hard, careful logistics. Before we leave this chapter, hold the image of the assistant again. Good suit, good posture, good intentions. He delivered a stack of bills because that's what his boss needed him to do. What he thought his boss needed him to do. There's a lesson in that about trust and leverage that goes beyond one zip code. If someone tells you to do something that doesn't make sense, and the timeline is strange, and the voice on the other end doesn't sound like itself, stop. Ask the question you'll wish you had asked. Make the call you'll wish you had made. In part 3, we go inside the trial. How the crust, the cameras, the cash, and the burn pattern turned into verdicts. How prosecutors told the story of 19 hours without showing a single moment of it on video. And how a jury weighed did he have help against the legal weight of what can we prove. For now, remember the 4 who couldn't leave that house: Savas, Amy, Philip, Vera, and the ordinary things that betrayed the extraordinary: a pizza box, a Porsche, a hang-up, and a flame. Trials are built to make chaos sit still long enough to be measured. When the doors closed and the jurors took their seats, the government's promise was simple. They would tell the story of 19 hours inside a house without a single frame of video. And when they were done, the only reasonable conclusion would be that Darren Wint turned a family home into a ransom chamber and then a tomb. Opening statements felt almost clinical. The prosecution didn't start with motive. They started with sequence. They walked jurors down Woodland Drive and through the front door, then slowed the clock to show how ordinary things, pizza boxes, phone pings, a cash pickup, a burned car, became anchors for something monstrous. They said bind, and the tape would prove it. They said extort, and the morning's cash would prove it. They said kill, and the autopsies would prove it. They said burn, and the fire patterns would prove it. Their promise was that each piece would click into place with the next, a set of interlocking gears turning toward the same name. The defense offered a different angle. They wondered aloud whether the government had drawn too tight a circle around one man because his DNA sat on a pizza crust, and whether others, never charged, had done the fuller work of an invasion that lasted through a night and a day. They would ask the jury to stare at gaps. No confession, no fingerprints that wrapped the whole house in one set of hands, no eyewitness to the first moment the door turned from barrier to invitation. They would say the government wanted certainty where life left smudges. Then came the slow accumulation of proofs, witness after witness. A firefighter described forcing the door and meeting smoke that rolled like an argument. An arson investigator explained how fire has a grammar, and this one read like sentences poured from a can. A medical examiner spoke with a voice that never rose and told the room what bodies already knew. Blunt force trauma for all, sharp force, injuries for the child, and for him the worst coda of all, thermal injuries that mean he was still alive when the flames began to do their work. The jurors wrote and didn't write, some staring at the table as if it could still the room. The evidence stepped out of the house and into the city. A technician mapped a blue Porsche through the streets on the afternoon of the fire, frame by frame, until it arrived at a church lot in Maryland and disappeared into heat and smoke. The lesson was ugly and simple. People trying to outrun a crime still have to move through a world full of cameras. Another analyst traced phone movements and messages that braided the day into a trackable route, the kind that turns conjecture into a map. And then there was the assistant. He sat in the witness box with a posture that said he had rehearsed how to hold his body together. His job had been to say yes, to schedule, to ferry, to carry things from here to there. And on that Thursday morning, he had done exactly what he was told. He retrieved $40,000 in cash from the boss's orbit and delivered it to the boss's house. He did not see the boy. He did not hear the tape coming off its roll in another room. He did not smell fear through a door that never opened for him. He made an errand and went back to his day because that is what assistants do when executives send them on a task. The defense pressed him on what he might have known, what he should have noticed, whether the tone of a message was off. But jurors could see what the job looks like from the inside. Compliance is a habit in those roles, not a plot. What began as a pizza finally arrived as science. A lab analyst explained how a crust from the kitchen trash was swabbed and profiled and matched in a database to the name on the indictment. The analyst did not dramatize anything. They simply laid out how saliva carries identity whether you intend it to or not, and how a casual bite, taken under pressure, can lay a trail straighter than any confession. The defense didn't argue with the DNA. They argued with what it meant. Maybe he was there, they suggested, but not the only one. Maybe not the one. The government didn't flinch. Presence at the table was the beginning, not the end, and everything else in the room would shoulder the rest of the weight. The government also tried to answer the question everyone asked in whispers: could one man control a house for so long? They didn't promise perfect clarity. They acknowledged what their own charging decision showed, that proving accomplices beyond a reasonable doubt is harder than feeling them in your bones. But they turned that difficulty into a strength by focusing on what could be proven. The money that moved because commands were followed. The car that burned because panic needed heat. The fire that climbed because someone gave it a ladder. And the DNA that stayed behind because hunger outlasted caution. Jurors were reminded that the law doesn't require every shadow to have a name. It requires the defendant's actions to be proven past doubt. By the time closing arguments arrived, the prosecution had a rhythm. Trace on the crust, trace in the car, trace in the timeline, and the old connection to the victim's company. The familiarity that turns a random address into a target. They described patience that would chill anyone, an evening of control, a night of threat, a morning of ransom, an afternoon of killing and fire. The defense returned to their gaps. They called the case a collage and urged the jurors to look at the white space between the pictures. Juries don't explain their hearts. They speak by form. When this one returned, the words came like a metronome. Guilty on the murders, guilty on the kidnappings, guilty on the burglary and the extortion, guilty on the arson and the theft. All counts. The reporters wrote all counts because it's shorter than listing how many ways a day can be broken and how many names a law can give to what is, in the end, one thing: the taking of lives. In that moment, the government's promise at the start had been kept. 19 hours had been told without video, and the telling held. Later, when the judge spoke at sentencing, the language bent toward what this case represented: a level of cruelty that felt incompatible with the city that raised the victims and the ambition that fueled them. Life without release stacked on itself until it expressed what the law can never precisely measure: that the future taken from 4 people cannot be restored, and so time must be taken from the one person the evidence placed at the center of the house. Even after the verdict, the question about help didn't die. It became a public murmur, the kind that follows hard cases when people try to make the world square again. Investigators had chased the possibilities. The prosecution had chosen the proof it could carry across the finish line. The verdict said what trials say at their best: this is what we can know, and this is what we can stand behind. In the quiet after the courtroom emptied, what remained were the names that started the case: Savas, Amy, Philip, and Vera, and the address that would never mean the same thing again to anyone who passed it. Trials are for the record. Grief is for the living. The jury did its job, the judge did his, and the city did what cities have to do after terrible things. It kept going, a little more alert to the fact that even grand houses depend on thin walls and human choices. In Part 4, the story will leave the verdict behind and sit with the aftermath: how the families and the city carried the weight, how the house and the neighborhood learned to take a breath again, and how the lesson of an ordinary pizza crust became a kind of civic parable about the small things that hold people accountable when monsters try to burn the rest away. When a case ends, the city keeps its promises in quiet ways. The cameras go. The tape comes down. Crews fix the door frame and scrub the soot from stone that was never meant to know fire. But the people don't return to how they were. The D.C. mansion murders left 4 empty chairs and a neighborhood that learned what it means to breathe around a scar. The first answer to violence is ceremony. In church light and family photos, Savas and Amy were eulogized with the kind of stunned grace that holds a room together when language isn't enough. Stories folded in on themselves: how meticulous he was about a job site, how she made a household run like a stage play where everyone knew their cues, how both of them collected people and made them feel like the most important person at the table. For Philip, the city was gentler than headlines. Teachers and friends remembered a boy with racing fuel in his veins and a piano in his hands, a kid who still had the kind of tomorrows that are more invention than plan. For Vera Figueroa, tributes spoke in the language working families understand best: reliability, kindness, dignity in motion. She had crossed a border years earlier, built a life from the ground up, and found a second home inside the Savopolis house. If grief measured distance, hers tied Maryland and Washington together like a braided cord. Courtrooms are meant for verdicts, not for healing. But the verdict let the next part begin. The sentence, life stacked on life, didn't pretend to balance what was taken. It did something more modest and more necessary. It closed a legal story so the human story could be told without having to look over its shoulder. Families could mourn without waiting for a date on a docket. The city could put the year on a shelf and start admitting privately that fear had followed them home from Woodland Drive. There is a practical gravity to aftermath. A company must decide how to carry on without its leader. Colleagues who once measured days in deliveries and deadlines began measuring in anniversaries. How the office felt this week last year. How lunch tasted the first day no one tried to make small talk because small talk had run out. The work continued, not out of denial, but because work is one of the few human rituals that can give shape to chaos. Neighborhoods heal by repetition. Dog walkers reclaimed the sidewalks. Joggers learned to pass the address without either speeding up or slowing down. The house itself changed. Walls were repaired, rooms redesigned, furniture replaced by furniture built to be sat on without remembering. Real estate has always known how to launder memory, but everyone who lived within a mile of Woodland Drive understood that a new coat of paint is only a truce. Homes remember because people remember. There was another kind of remembering, quieter, more stubborn. The families built their own languages for the days that hurt. Birthdays and holidays rearranged themselves. New rituals appeared where old ones could not be endured. Someone who used to host now brings flowers. Someone who used to talk keeps time by washing dishes until the kitchen is clean enough to stand in. In the background, the questions that trials cannot answer kept their place like uninvited guests. Did he have help? Could anything have changed the outcome once the first tape was torn from its roll? Why this house, this family, this day? The city made its own adjustments. Security companies ran more cameras. Residents checked settings they had ignored. Assistants and house staff across Upper Northwest learned to trust their own alarms. When a text feels wrong, when a request carries the kind of urgency that looks like someone else's script, when a schedule suddenly develops blind spots at the edges. The lesson was not paranoia, it was vigilance. The $40,000 that moved across town became, in boardrooms and back offices, a parable about process. Organizations rewrote their if this, then that memos, so no one alone would have to decide between doing their job and saving a life they couldn't see. None of that brings comfort the way people imagine comfort works. Comfort doesn't arrive. It accumulates. It builds from the smallest competent acts. Meals delivered without questions, rides offered without talk, the steady presence of people who do not flinch at the sight of tears. Over time, a community becomes fluent in one another's grief, and the worst day stops having the power to erase all the others. That is not the whole truth. There is also anger, and anger has a long half-life. The brutality of the case, the tape, the overnight captivity, the extraction of cash, the killing, the fire, was a violation of the city's self-image. Washington knows corruption and chaos in its public life. It does not easily admit either into its private homes. The nickname that television gave the case, Mansion Murders, wasn't wrong about property values, but it missed what people here felt most deeply. The sense that safety had been betrayed from inside the ordinary, with pizza boxes and a working day used as tools for harm. When the anger cooled, it left behind a conviction that ordinary would need a sturdier definition. There were gestures that didn't make the news and didn't need to. A scholarship pledged in a young boy's name, a donation in a housekeeper's honor to a group that helps other families build what she built, a bench placed under a tree where a certain kind of light falls in late afternoon. Cities collect these fragments into memory the way tide pools collect shells, accidentally and perfectly. In the years that followed, the courtroom question, did he act alone, settled into a different shape for the people who mattered. Whatever the logistics, the culpability acknowledged by the verdict was enough to support the living. Some mysteries are kept and carried. You can feel them in the way conversations move around certain subjects, in the way eyes meet and then look away at the same beat. It is not denial, it is a choice to prioritize the parts of the story that do the least harm. The most important part has always been the names. Say them now the way the families say them when no one is listening. Savas, Amy, Philip, Vera. They don't define the worst thing that happened to them. They define the best things they gave away while they were here. A company that treated its people like people. A household that worked because someone did the dozens of unseen tasks that make a day humane. A marriage that turned ambition into generosity, a childhood bright enough to light a room that can never be lit the same way again. If the case taught the city anything, it was to respect the power of small details. A piece of crust in a kitchen trash can, a car that became a signal fire, a hang-up call that nonetheless sent help, a timestamp on a receipt. The smallest things anchored the largest story. That is a civic lesson, not just a forensic one. We are held together by the small acts we do right when no one is watching, and we are held accountable by the small traces we leave when we do wrong. There is a final image that does not erase the others but sits beside them, making space. It is a grand piano that has been tuned again. It does not forget heat or ash or tape. It remembers. But memory has always been where music begins. Somewhere in that neighborhood, a child is learning a scale. Somewhere a driver eases a car through a turn and looks up at a stand of old trees and lets his shoulders drop. Somewhere an office closes for the day, and the last person out hits the light and knows that tomorrow will be ordinary again on purpose. That is how a city answers an act meant to terrify it, with work, with ritual, with care, with names. This is where we end. Not because the story is finished, stories like this don't finish, but because it has been set down carefully enough to be carried forward. If you pass Woodland Drive, let the air change for a moment and then let it settle. If you tell the story, tell it the way a good city remembers. With the people first, the cruelty plain, the lessons intact, and the promise that vigilance and kindness will outlast even 19 hours of darkness. If you want true cases told, without sensationalism, with the victims at the center, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next episode. In the comments, honor their names: Savas, Amy, Philip, and Vera. Share responsibly. Your support helps us keep making careful, respectful storytelling.